Off mute. All right. Welcome everyone to the first Our Jewish Male Journey webinar presented by Menschwork, which is the succeeding parent organization to the over 25-year-old Jewish Men's Retreat. And we're pleased to have our first presentation tonight by Rabbi Sean Zevit, who's a founding board member of Menschwork and of the Jewish Men's Retreat. And he'll be discussing the principles that underlie the personal explorations and brotherly connections that take place in the sacred container of the Jewish Men's Retreat and are being carried to our now additional Menschwork activities. The Men's Retreat has been gathering for 25 years, and the next one will be this coming November. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Zevit.
Thank you, Mark, so much. I want to also say that Brother Yosef August will be adding perspectives tonight as part of the presentation as one of the progenitors, one of the founding fathers of our Menschwork here as well. And I want to offer tonight's teaching. It's a Jewish tradition to offer teaching in the kavod and the honor of, or in the memory of our teachers. And with the recent passing of Harry Brode at age 66, who is really a founder of the thought process and the idea of Jewish masculinities. I'll say more about that in the context of the presentation. Want to dedicate our work tonight to Harry, who has really impacted the larger North American and global culture, and the idea of a male affirmative, feminist, deeply masculinities identity for many of us. So to Harry's memory. Lech lecha, 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 lech lecha. And the Eternal said to Avram, Lech lecha, get up and go, or get up and go into yourself, from your native land, from your father's house, to the land I will show you, and you will be a blessing. Bereshit, Genesis chapter 12. The particular challenges and opportunities facing Jewish men today, and when I use that term, I have no specific definition other than how people might self-identify ourselves as either Jewish or male in this day and age. It connects with the most ancient callings of that Lech Lecha. So our work requires a roadmap that is informed but not determined by the past or limited by it. Some of us here tonight, or those of you listening or watching at another point in time, may have been handed the richness of a Jewish legacy or lineage, or you may be partnered with someone who you've, co-developed a Jewish home with its customs, its rituals, its insights. And so you can add your own personal story to that life of Avram and patriarchs and matriarchs. However, for many Jewish identified men today, that is not necessarily a given. And we may have received little from our parents, or were antagonistic to what we experienced. Some Jewish men have experienced in men's groups and movements, but have been out of touch with their Jewish identity. Others are well grounded in Jewish expression, but have never explored being consciously in a group of men, or have few or surface relationships with other men in their lives. Still others have had neither, or very little of both. And for some of us, even here tonight, we might have raised our hands for each one of those because they reflect a different period in our life. So at this time, We are further along the road less traveled, but still in many ways in the beginning of finding a voice for our experience in the 21st century as Jewish men. We may have received whatever Jewish lineage and legacy, and many of us have been informed, certainly in the liberal Jewish world, by feminism, understanding and exploration of gender constructs, the larger men's movement or Jewish men's movement, our own unique cultural experiences, depending on where we've grown up, Canada, the US, Israel, Europe, South America, any number of cultures that have helped identify both the Jewish and the male experience. Many of us may have partners with someone who was not born or does not identify as Jewish. There's been shifts in family structures, and the technological age and the media are very influential and are co-arising with our own experience today. And that's sometimes we can see a generational divide. Even when technology, I know one 16-year-old young man said, "Oh, I use this form of technology. I'm not even going to state it because we'll already date the call. You know, in 1 week it'll have all changed." But he said, "I use this technology. The 15-year-old and under, they use that other technology." There's always already even a divide within teenagehood, depending on what has, come out as forms of communication and expression. And at the same time, we have been in these generations, and here I credit thinking of Reb Zalman Schachter, Shalomi Zuchanal Abracha, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, others who have contributed to bringing in a new Jewish experience in our day and age. So many of us have developed and been able to find access to community study, an understanding of peoplehood, relationships, and a striving to live in God's image in new ways we define that, or even without a theology or theism, a no God, or perhaps self, truth, however we understand some sense of the ultimate. So the confluence of these issues and the larger contemporary men and women's issues makes for a rich and unique mix that can be addressed by us here within the Menschwork field that we've been working at for over 25 years. We have experimented with a reconnection to longstanding Jewish traditions on our own terms, valuing tradition, but also bringing in new expressions in prayer, in Torah study, using mikveh, developing new ritual experiences, as well as providing a safe place to deal with varied issues of concern for us today. For many men who have been active in the larger arena of men's work, there's often a lack of connection to their Jewish heritage, which is just beginning to be made available through some of the activities that many of us have been so committed to for these years. And I think another core piece that we have from the beginning made important in Menschwork is not only the spiritual growth element, but a commitment to tikkun, to the healing and the balancing of the planet. That in this day and age, being men with a ecological, sustainable consciousness is as core to anything else in the Jewish and male lexicon, if we're to have a shared future on this planet. So this is not an exhaustive or academic background. I can hear beloved Harry Brode somewhat snickering even in his recent departure, going on, "What a nice populist version, Sean, but go for it anyway." So I feel I have his hechsher. In the late 1960s and especially in the 1970s, men, often particularly men of some privilege, though there was some class distinction, and more often white presenting men than others, and more often cisgendered hetero-identified men than others, but began to gather to address issues of dislocation, shifting male and female roles, to investigate their connection or disconnection to their masculinity. And I'm using that as a masculinity intentionally right now until I get to Harry's and Michael Kimmel's contributions, and a myriad of other issues that included simply wanting to be close to each other at a basic level that other prior generations of Jewish men seem to have woven in the fabric without necessarily thinking about it as masculinity, but were part of communal structures and ways of being that had broken, especially since the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the Second World War onward, had somewhat shattered or even evaporated in landing in North American culture in particular. As the 70s and 80s progressed, it became apparent that there was no men's movement in the same way that there might have been a feminist or a women's movement beginning in the 60s and 70s. Rather, there were different streams of focus that men could rally around. The stream that gained the most notoriety was termed mythopoetic, not necessarily by the men doing the work, such as Michael Meade and Robert Moore, Robert Bly, James Hilleman, New Warriors, etc. That stream gained the most, was termed mythopoetic because it often explored male spirituality with a Jungian-based psychology. This stream, often identified by the media and public as the men's movement, attracted mostly heterosexual identified midlife men who would delve into their masculinity and male psyches at retreats, support groups, council meetings, lectures. These would center around literature, mythology, art, creativity, drumming, rituals, some borrowed from First Nation traditions. And there, even today, were gatherings and our gatherings and trainings that deepen positive male identity and relationship under the wing of New Warriors training and other names that have evolved since that time. So this pro-feminist male affirmative stream grew up alongside the women's movement, and as a separate stream, those who took a more social or philosophic construct approach were often termed men's liberation, where men were encouraged to challenge and move beyond sexist, homophobic, class and race barriers. Women's rights, gay rights, and other causes centered around the groups that were marginalized in society were often emphasized. And here's where Harry Brode, Michael Kimmel, Michael Kaufman, John Stoltenberg were among the men that helped bring these men's issues into the fore. In Canada, where I grew up, after a horrific violent attack on female students at McGill University by a man who had a lot of sexist rantings in this violent act, a white ribbon campaign was organized to protest against and work towards ending male violent patterns. Though women were also involved and are involved in this area, that's had some difficulty maintaining its energy and organization since the 1990s on the same level. But here's where I want to bring in Harry Brode, Seehorn of blessed memory, who was born in Berlin in 1951 and lived in Belgium, and then his parents both, who he called temporary survivors of the Holocaust. And he stated that term because both of them died relatively young after the war, and his feeling was they didn't survive the Holocaust, they were temporary survivors because the impact of the Holocaust shortened their lives. So that's an important piece of identity that Harry brings in terms of marginalization and his exploring what these identities might mean in North American culture, where he got PhD, graduate school, NYU, California, Kenyon, finally ended up in Philadelphia and spent the last 15 years of his life with his partner Karen in Iowa, University of Northern Iowa. So Harry is widely recognized as a founding figure of the field of men's studies, also known as studies in masculinities, which applies theories and concepts derived from women's studies to examine men and masculinities. His first book was the first to carry the pluralized masculinities in its title. This has now become standard scholarly convention, and Brode's leadership is recognized in moving the field away from a monolithic concept of masculinity to embrace diversity at its core, to study men and masculinities as we vary by race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, religion, able-bodiedness, and so many other categories. So I want to drop in just a few words about Harry before getting back to our evolving men's consciousness streams and bring Yosef in at that moment too. So in the foreword to Brother Keeper's New Essays in Jewish Masculinities that Harry and I co-edited, he goes on to say, in joining or engendering a conversation about men from specifically Jewish perspectives, in some contexts it makes sense to speak of a specific Jewish masculinity, while in other contexts it makes more sense to speak of specific Jewish masculinities. The academic field of men's studies or masculinity studies moved from speaking of that in the singular to speaking of it plural in early development. To speak of masculinity or a male sex role or identity in the singular simply paints with too broad a brush, leaving most men feeling that what's being discussed is an abstract caricature that does not really capture their own lives and the lives of men they know. Masculinities are experienced and therefore must be analyzed as they vary according to a high range of categories, many of which are hierarchical and we ourselves as men received through patriarchal hierarchical structures. So I just wanted to put some of Harry's own words into the mix of that. So the men's rights stream, which was another third kind of burgeoning field that began in the 60s and 70s, largely focuses on changing laws and societal perception of men, be it challenging issues around child custody, support, rights of unmarried fathers, gay or straight or heterosexual. The men's rights advocates have tended to be more militant than other men's groups. Gatherings usually take the form of support groups, Father's Day events involving children, legal strategy, and media campaigns. Warren Farrell had a very popular book about the myth of male power that brought some notoriety to that perspective. I also want to give a shout out to one of our other brothers, Rabbi Shalom Schachter, Rabbi Zalman's son, who's also a rabbi, because before I knew much of this or even had met Yosef, Shalom took on the federal law in Canada by claiming paternity leave when his second child was born. And his employer said, "I'm sorry, there is no such thing," which allowed him to then take this to court, and he followed it all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which sided with him. And by doing that, he changed the law of Canada, and now that men as well as women can claim and mix and match any number of weeks that are allowed under Canadian law. So that's a whole other level of men's consciousness and activism to change the systems of which we are all a part. So more recent developments, in North America scene have included addiction and men's addiction and recovery groups out of the 12 steps. Not surprisingly, the renewed interest in spiritual matters combined with the return, and here I want to just name whether we all agree with some of these streams or not, but family values in the religious right. There was a period of time, and they still exist, huge gatherings, tens of thousands of men in stadiums under promise keepers, stadiums doubling as religious sanctuaries where men were exhorted to overcome their failings and recommit to their families. Some uncertainty as to whether this is progressive or regressive is open for debate, but the sheer number and passion exposed indicate an empty place in the soul that was being addressed by such gatherings. And African American and Black Canadian men, other men of color have also developed groups in the last 20 years. Now, of course, we have chat rooms, websites, magazines, media programs, which have its light and their shadow side when it comes to pornography and a variety of other things that have pulled in and challenged some of our consciousness that way. So to move now into, more specifically Jewish peace, I think we would also all be terribly filled with hubris and disingenuous if we talked about the Jewish men's gatherings we have invented. That's why I started off with our Torah and Lech Lecha. So we've got at least a 4,000-year, if not longer, journey. They may not have gathered in Isabella Freedman or Pearlstone or any number of regional gathering places that we've been developing, but our ancestors were onto this long before some of these constructs developed. Even the mandate to form, while we're now in liberal circles more inclusive of women, but the mandate to form a minyan of 10 men, that there were a group of men was required to hold God's presence, to pray, to have certain ritual events take place, was mitigating against some of the Greek and the other ideas of the solo man's heroic journey. The aspect of being a Jewish man in community, where one was empowered, is a beginning. Even Avram's direction in the Lech Lecha is not a solo journey. Sarai is there and part of that. Her name means princess, so I got to figure she was a heavy hitter. And he brings in his nephew, who his brother, deceased brother. Say, okay, I've got to care for my family. This isn't just my own pilgrimage that I'm taking, and all that journey that ensues around that. Even in North America, many of us grew up within the framework of brotherhood or men's clubs, of a synagogue or Jewish community center or B'nai B'rith Lodge. If not ourselves, then maybe we had parents or grandparents active in that way. In the last couple of decades, the attendance and participation in these traditional forms of gathering in a Jewish context have been challenged to maintain their membership at previous levels. That's part of a longer discussion about trends of belonging and identification in Jewish community, but I think it's important to name it. Or they've expanded to include women's participation or lost relevance for many Jewish men who are not connected to those institutions. The formal men's groups within Jewish institutional life continue to shift to meet contemporary needs, while many of us have found a home in informal groups that may meet once or twice a month in homes. And this was a natural outgrowth from the model of some women's groups, or Rosh Chodesh, or the Chavurah movement, or the renewal of Jewish life that gave birth to that within a Jewish context. So over time, many of us began to try to articulate our vision to meet the need that so many of us were having and the feelings that we had. This has included, but not limited to, our examining our heritage, the state of current male identity and spirituality. And the lack of material dealing with those concerns meant that many of us, much like our sisters, had to use tradition but create our own experiences to find out what was relevant. So I'm going to invite Yosef August in at this moment, because I can claim with great delight meeting Yosef at the 1993 Aleph Kala, though we had met a year prior at some things we still can't identify, or perhaps as our tradition, everybody here was at Sinai, so we have some trace remembrance of us all gathering for the revelation of Torah some millennia ago. But Yosef, I want to, if you could, bring us back to 1988 and then move us to that, Kala and some of the formative ideas of the values and our objectives in Menschwork, even before it was called that. I'm going to unmute you. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Reb Sean, and thank you for creating this venue, this event tonight to do this. I guess we should have called the retreat this past year the 4025th, right? Because it has been going on for a while. Okay, so maybe we have to, have a little going over some of our materials. Back in that at the early days of my own involvement in this, when we in the world of Jewish renewal, when people gathered, there really was not a place. There were so many. It seemed like so many places for women to do incredibly wonderful, powerful work, but there really wasn't a place for men to talk with each other and connect with each other, and there was also at that point such a discrediting of the traditional masculine paradigm, and there was nothing exactly emerging that we were conscious of that was something for us to be playing a part of. And so we started to gather very ad hoc at the various gatherings. We would just go off and have basically a go round, and for me. I'll be brief, but I just like you to also let me know, Sean, in terms of going on. But there was a lot in terms of the kind of narratives that I grew up with and heard and about men and Torah, that it wasn't a terribly positive story. I mean, we have so much dysfunctionality, but you have these kinds of things like, Isaac was just so easily deceived, those kinds of things that were, and all of a sudden I came upon Rami Shapiro's work, Embracing Esau, and reclaiming the deep masculine in Judaism. And all of a sudden that really seemed to really open things up to me. And he was talking about the hero's journey. Okay, he wasn't talking necessarily of a collective, but he was talking about everybody playing a role in his journey. Even Laban, that they were that all of the people were playing ways that were playing roles in his hero's journey. And that's really when you and I met at a kala, putting out a kind of a poster session of Jewish men in Torah, deep Torah and the deep masculine, or something like that. And we started to walk into these stories, and we started to see, what do they have to tell us? Like, what blessing didn't we get from our fathers? And those are really, I'm getting chills as I'm saying that, because it's just started to open up the idea that our stories and our rituals were really potential tools for us to start to redefine a positive kind of, we used it in the singular of masculinity. But what is a renewed masculinity that we define, that we design ourselves, and it's not somebody else's narrative for us as men? I think that's been really the story, kind of the arc of our story over 25 years, written by us and the other men on this call, and so many other generations of men who've come in with their creativity, with their either their deep Jewish knowledge or lack thereof that enabled them to be even more creative. But anyway, I hope that's that's helpful here.
Tremendously so. And Yosef, if I can add, because I think it's an important piece, is that first day at that Kala in Berkeley, it was just you and I in the room. And I think as we watched by all these men dancing and singing and renewing their Jewish life there, but not necessarily seeing their exploration of their masculinity, however they identified, gay, bi, trans, hetero, whatever the identification, or beyond those labels, we kind of mused. And as always, we are also individuals. Monty Python is imprinted on my brain, so we are all brothers. I'm not, like at the moment that we all have these, different imprints. So, you had more fire about that from a perspective, because we're close in proximity and age, but slightly different generations. And I was more kind of curious in that way, and we both wrestled with, okay, where is everybody? But I think part of the decision to spread the word, and by the second and the third and the final day we started to accrue folks, was we need to be responsible for getting this on the agenda. And instead of blaming or critiquing other men for not showing, I think we stepped into that question with some of the men who then gathered with us there. Let's get on the future agenda. Let's make sure, there's a corresponding men's, mikvah, and eventually that's spawn men and women's and, gender inclusive or beyond gender mikvahot, a different kolot that way. So I think the birth of what became the first annual, though you had helped start men's gatherings in 1988 and other.
That was in the Neanderthal phase.
That was look, Cro-Magnon, please. I want to hold the image that we were a little bit beyond Neanderthal at that time. But, so I just want to lay that down too, that the question of what are our circumstances is one thing, but what do we do about them and how do we do it? And that we claimed, in a sense, looking at building around a Shabbaton, looking at Torah and our lineage, looking at the deep masculinities and setting up groups where we could explore and safe process, kind of pulled the best of many different approaches with other, men to develop that. And, and I think equally important to today has been, I want to thank, Herbie, Elliot, others for nurturing younger Jewish men and creating scholarships and not having this just a generational phenomenon with which often I feel some renewing with a small r, not a big R, endeavors tend to then close the loop and focus around that particular generation as they move through, kind of codifying their experience and not keeping to break it open to others. But in this moment in time, I know we have Alan Spivak on the phone. And Alan, just before I go, add a few more pieces to this presentational part, you jumped on the train when it left the station, but very early on. And I know you wrote with Yosef and some contribution from me, an article that you both put together for Brother Keepers. I wonder if you can say, because I think a piece of your story early on is important, that it wasn't, oh, I was immersed in this Jewish context and trying to figure out the masculine thing, that's like you may have another way of characterizing your journey, but it almost feels like you kind of happened upon this or came in with some resistance or skepticism, and found yourself stepping in and helping shape as well. So I think that's an important piece of the story, so it doesn't feel like we are the world, oh, we all got together and everyone thought the same and woo, that sort of thing. So Alan, I'm wondering if you could add a few more words from your own perceptions of the beginning of Menschwork as we've defined it. I've just unmuted you.
All right. Good. Okay. Well, I'm here. I want to extend a yashikov to both Sean and Yosef about for what he has to say. But some of it was really revelatory for me. I didn't know a lot of these some of these pieces that you discussed tonight, so I appreciate that. I came to my first retreat in 1994. I think it was the fourth retreat, and a friend.
It was actually the second annual, Alan.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yes. Only because we're recording, I want that to, the record should show. But please continue. For you, it was the fourth. For us, it was the second.
Okay. So I was a contractor at the time, and a man that I was working with told me about it. He'd been there the year before, so I took the plunge and I drove out with him. And I guess when I reflect on it, it was a combination of being startled that men actually could be in community like this. It was a sense of terror and feeling totally out of my element, out of my comfort zone. And yet I was bearing witness to this amazing experience of watching men in these small groups discuss things that I'd never even considered talking about. And even in the larger community activities, people were very open. It was for me, I guess the thing that was most startling for me was the amount of pain that men were carrying with them and were willing to share. And then that immediately connected to my own story. My father died when I was relatively young, and all the things that followed from that. So I made it through the weekend, and I was so terrified by that experience, I didn't go back the next year. And then, for whatever reason, I opted to go the following year and haven't missed one since. And I became very active and involved for a number of years. I retired from that a few years ago and tried to help grow and build the organization. But I think perhaps the most wonderful thing that I've learned from it, in addition to having so many positive relationships, and this has taken me years to kind of to integrate into my day-to-day life. It's not something that I learned like a whole skill set one year and then all of a sudden I was a changed man. Nothing like that. It took years and years to slowly remake myself. But the thing that I observed and benefited from was the mentoring that went on constantly in informal ways and more formal ways, in the planning process, in the conversations that happened between retreats, and that to me has done more to impact my own life and my own relationship with other men now, and I value that so much. And to this day, that's continuing, and I think it's the most important aspect of the retreat, because here men really care, love for each other, express it very open and honest ways and in a heartfelt way. And it's quite remarkable that for me to see this at each retreat, and that it hasn't diminished in the least. It hasn't become formulaic in any way or trite. There's a lot of very sincere interaction. So I of all the things that I've gotten out of attending and being part of this organizing, I think that's the thing that stands out most for me.
Thank you so much, Alan. Really appreciate that. And as I suspected, your part of the story is really important because it includes us finding a place where we can deal with resistance and struggle, fear, not knowing, embarrassment of, bringing some of our embarrassment, which I've experienced over the years of people not being Jewishly literate enough, or not being aware, of larger sensitivities. And even sometimes some tensions between old school ideas and senses of humor and contemporary sensitivities, and and various places of the tradition. We've had men who are much more traditional in their practice, others who are coming, and when I think of actually I'll save that to the end. I think when we can talk about where we go to, where are areas, and groups of men, however identified, that still need to be nurtured. But going to pick up the timeline now that I've been encouraged by Alan in the revelation category, and by no means is this comprehensive for all of you who are wiser than I and have more feelers into various aspects of this work. I by no means mean this overview to be all-inclusive or all-encompassing, but concurrent with the work that many of us have been doing, and sometimes with our involvement as well over the years, other Jewish men began to create resources, gatherings, or developing responses to these questions. Rabbi Kari Olitsky, Rabbi Rami Shapiro that Yosef mentioned before, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, even just exploring his relationship with his own brother, not necessarily as a treatise on masculinity, but a personal volume by a Jewish man about their brother. Harry, of course, Rabbi Mordechai Liebling, Rabbi Jeff Salkin, Doug Barden in the Reform movement, Charles Simon in the Conservative movement, Joel Grishaver, Peter Pitzley, who was exploring Jewish male archetypes through bibliodrama and other midrashic approaches, and many other Jewish men and women who have been writing about gender and Judaism. So that suddenly we started to see articles appearing in newspapers. Harry's A Mensch Amongst Men, sadly now out of print, but in 1988 was really kind of the first to pull some essays together, and Yosef and others contributed. Larry Bush, who was another earlier contributor, who also contributed to Brother Keepers, began to try to give voice to the varieties of these experiences. And even the Center for Gender Studies, which spun off to become Moving Traditions at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and the arrival of Lori Lefkowitz, bringing a kind of gendered approach to Jewish identity, and that exploration got born in the 1990s as well. And then later on, Neharim, the LGBTQ gathering, which included some men who identified as gay or bi or trans or whatever other gender construct was appropriate for them, found that as a place to be. We, of course, try to be as inclusive as possible, and ourselves discover that sometimes language can be heteronormative, and the men's retreat or Jewish men. So who does that speak to? So we've had much more inclusivity when we've spelled out particular groups of men and not assumed that everybody thought that they were included. And we have some men who attend our retreat and who have attended Neharim retreat, that in some places they want to focus more on the Jewish masculinities aspect, and other places want to be more in the conversation of what it means to be gay or bi or trans. identified as a male. So there's a lot of different opportunities that have developed, and certainly in the more organized reform and conservative worlds, the revisiting, the passing of the torch with both Doug Barton and Charles Simon deputizing others after many years of running those organizations. And those organizations are revisioning themselves as well as to what does it mean when you see suddenly men, say 45 and 50, over part of those traditional structures and younger men not. So I think there's a morphing in the entire field, even if it's more kind of mainline institutional or more in the kind of grassroots populist version. But I think a key question to understanding the movement towards new forms of expression for male spirituality and identity is often what draws us together. What is behind that longing, no matter what the answer to that is. And as you described beautifully, Yosef and Alan, for some of us, it's the opportunity, structured and informal, for deep sharing with other men. For some, in fact, the structure is really important. Our mishpacha groups, our facilitator with the facilitation training, etc., that not some men have experience in men's groups, which myself and Steve have been together now for a couple of decades in ours, who have come to that with an understanding or of a generation of sharing. Where other men, the informal sharing is not a safe place, and having a real solid structure becomes a container in which to even explore the feelings or the expressions that Yosef, you were telling about before. And others, again, may have experience in those men's groups, but have been out of touch with Jewish identity. And to walk in and see vibrant prayer or exploration of a parsha in the Torah, or all these Jewish activities, or transformative mikvaot, whatever fashion they take. We've had the water-based, the air-based, we've experimented with different forms over time. That can, blow somebody their whole mind as well, just seeing that there's a relevance of Jewish lineage in this as well. And some of us, as I said before, come with both, and some with neither. I'll always remember the one retreat where we were beginning and they had an orientation, and there was a gentleman, maybe in his 60s, with a wonderful powder blue suit and a tie. And we said, "Oh, hi, how did you get here?" He said, "Well, actually, my wife's on retreat here in a separate place, and she told me I should come and do this because I had nothing else to do." So sometimes people wander in as part of the mixed multitude, and we pick each other up along the journey that way. There have been other developments, though, too, outside even a more traditional or Orthodox environment where they would be part of natural Jewish expression. But the way we've done Torah study, enacting it through bibliodrama, through bringing these pieces alive, Kiddush Levanah, monthly celebrations of the new moon, which again is a tradition, but a number of us revived that in the in the 80s and 90s and onwards as a ritual gathering for Jewish men. And I remember many times with the parental permission and the willingness of the young man, inviting 13-year-old young men to come in that circle of men outdoors under the moon and receive blessings. And and I only know the impact of that by one of those young men, who is the actually son of a rabbi, who wrote an article for a Jewish women's magazine a decade later and talked about how their real bar mitzvah happened in that circle with men under the moon at Kiddush Levanah, that gave them a sense of Jewish male consciousness that they didn't receive in some of the other places. So we'll never be fully aware of how we've really influenced each other that way. One of the differences is, unlike the past and some iterations of men's and Jewish men's work, that we're not looking to set up a dominance over the exclusion of women, or by definition, though we may be unconscious of it at times, but not by definition to create a heteronormative center or exclude Jewish men of color, whatever, or ability issues. There's an attempt, whether we're successful or not, of really opening up and seeing it as radiant centers and circles of different Jewish male identity, without one identity map at the center defining what even Jewish masculinity or Jewish male and menschwork means that regard. Doesn't mean we don't have our shadow side, but I feel that we at least try to illuminate that shadow and raise it up to the light for discussion. And I also will say that there's times where I've been invited to come to a synagogue or a Jewish place. This was more in the 90s. To, oh, you're doing that Jewish men's work. Can you come and like help us counter feminism, or be a counterpoint to the sisterhood, and their encroachment on leadership of the synagogue? And I would generally say, I really hear you. That's not my work and not what I'm particularly called to or interested in, and try to engage those men in understanding what the fear and reactivity was about. So we're trying to be conscious in that regard. And we have received a great deal of support from female colleagues and women in various communities for the work that we're taking on that has been very encouraging. So if anything, building trust between us and learning how to relate to each other beyond the avenues previously afforded, or revisiting and renewing and reconstructing those, is allowing many of us, and Alan's testimony is a perfect example, to push past competition, insecurity, and fears, and traditional ways that men might have set up relationships with each other. Forging a compassionate, relevant, and authentic Jewish spiritual life deepens this dimension, so our renewed Jewish expression enhances and supports our journeys as men in an age of rapid change in roles and expectations. Guilt, feeling of shame, inadequacy, blaming each other, that keeps the baggage we drag along stuck in place. But the assertion of identities and expression must neither be dominating and abusive, nor so passive and apologetic that leads to a flattening of behavior. So as all these previous hierarchical power structures and roles are being challenged, changed, transformed, albeit painfully slow at times, I want to recognize a certain amount, at least I'm looking around, of white privilege that many of us who present white benefits. So we have access to certain things that other brothers in various socioeconomic class and race or gender, sexual orientation may see it much more painfully slowly than some of us. But these ways in which Jewish men are seeking to deepen our connection to each other, to women, to people of all faiths and backgrounds, is helping to realign the relationships in community. And we've been committed in Menschwork to create these connections in such a way that values what is rich and meaningful in the past, allows us to work together and support each other in creative, compassionate, and insightful ways towards a healthy future. The Jewish technology available to us is rich and diverse in ways that makes this work such a blessing in these days. And we have sacred texts that allow us to explore our own individual and collective path ritually, and providing us with a context and opportunity to be creative in meeting new issues and new needs as they arise. I really so appreciate, Joseph, you're mentioning like some of us who came in knowing and others who didn't have a clue. And so the creativity was the default, not the preferred exploration, but that also is a creative tension that we hold in our work that's part and parcel of it. And I imagine, more and more men who are committed to raising Jewish children but may not be themselves, or diversity across the rainbow and the color palette of human expression and male identity coming and reshaping things. And what would it be to have some of our younger men, which we tried to do as well, increasingly taking charge of framing certain things, which was so beautiful last year of having that happen, while part of what they chose to do was honor some of us who had done that work before. And I think that's a really important piece of Menschwork, that it is about honoring eldering and about mentoring, but also not paternalizing younger men at the same time, and also younger men who are then looking to honor and be mentored as well as teach us of their experience. I find all too often, even in our cool and groovy circles, that there's a breakdown when I look at who gathers to lead a davening or lead a workshop. I'm finding it increasingly split generationally. Whereas when I was coming through, to sit at the feet of an older man or to learn from someone or to be in a cross-generational facilitation or workshop was so exciting. And I'm finding that part of that is not happening the same way with a millennial and even younger generation. And so that's something I think that we need to pay attention to that way. So I'll finish this this part, which going back to Breshit, to Genesis, but even before there is a male construct. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it states, the one, existence itself, created humans in God's image, male and female, and God blessed them. So like the charge to Avram to be called that he might become, to grow into Avraham in a new place he knew not, and then be blessed. So we are asked and are asking to expand our self-image to more fully reflect the imaging of God and the imaging of our own identities in our lives. Ultimately, we have come to feel in our approach to Menschwork, this can only be achieved by trust and with determination and compassion, so we can chart a new course into a traditional and yet unknown place, so that we can become the blessing that we're meant to be. Amen. Ken Yehi Ratzon. as Herbie chuckles. So Mark, I want to pass it, I think, back to you at this moment, whichever one of the Marks. I'm forgetting the thread, but I know there's some, just a transitional moment. Is there anything either of you want to say in terms of our process before we open things up? Just wave at me if you do, and I'll unmute you. Are we good? Are we ready to open things up that way? Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop the recording.